Alcohol has been part of human life for a very long time, longer than writing, longer than cities. It is one of the first things people figured out how to make, not through planning, but by noticing what nature already did. At some point, thousands of years ago, someone left fruit out too long. Maybe it was grapes, maybe berries, maybe mashed dates in a bowl. Whatever it was, it started to ferment. Natural yeasts in the air got into it, and the sugars turned into alcohol. The result probably smelled a little strange. It might have been fizzy or sour, but someone tasted it, and it changed the way they felt. That small discovery, probably an accident, set off something bigger. Wherever people had access to fruit, grain, or honey, fermentation eventually followed. No single culture invented it. The pattern repeated itself in many places, at different times, often without any connection between them. In northern China, around 7000 BCE, pottery jars held traces of a fermented mixture made from rice, honey, and fruit. That is the earliest physical evidence we have, a kind of early wine. It was not refined and probably did not taste good by today's standards, but it did the job. By 5000 BCE, in what is now Iran, people were making grape wine. A few thousand years later, the Sumerians in Mesopotamia were brewing beer. They even wrote down hymns to Ninkasi, the goddess of brewing. These hymns also served as rough brewing instructions. The Egyptians brewed beer too. It was thick, more like a liquid porridge, and it was a major part of the diet. Workers who built the pyramids were often paid in beer, not as a luxury, but as nutrition, hydration, and calories. Wine existed as well, though it was mostly reserved for the wealthy. It was used in rituals and buried in tombs. Across the ancient world, alcohol took many forms. In the Andes, people chewed maize to help it ferment into a kind of beer. In Africa, people used sorghum or millet. In the Pacific Islands, they brewed kava from the roots of a local plant. Each region worked with what was available and created its own version. Alcohol was not only about getting drunk. It had roles in medicine, in religion, in agriculture, and in trade. People used it in ceremonies and celebrations. They made offerings with it. They brought it along when they traveled or bargained. It helped define social roles and cultural identity. By the time written history begins, alcohol is already present. It is not new. It is simply part of life. Quiet and ordinary. Something people made and used without needing to explain why. Its beginning was not marked by any one invention or discovery. It came from small observations, passed from one generation to the next, repeated until it became part of what it meant to be human. By the time we get to the ancient Mediterranean, alcohol isn't just something people stumble upon. It's something they structure their lives around. The Greeks didn't invent wine, but they gave it a kind of weight. It wasn't just a drink anymore. It became tied to conversation, ritual, and social order. At a symposium, men would gather to recline, eat, and talk while drinking wine mixed with water. Drinking it undiluted was considered uncivilized. Everything had its rhythm. Cups were passed in a set order. Music might play quietly in the background, and the wine kept flowing. Over all of this hovered Dionysus, the god of wine. But not just wine, also madness, celebration, and the loss of control. His festivals were theatrical, noisy, and unpredictable. For the Greeks, alcohol was a way to loosen the boundaries between people, sometimes between people and the gods. The Romans picked up where the Greeks left off, but they didn't stop with meaning. They turned wine into infrastructure. As the Roman Empire expanded, So did its vineyards. Wherever they settled, they planted grapes. Southern France, North Africa, coastal Spain. Wine was everywhere. It was Roman to drink wine. Beer was for outsiders, for people beyond the border. Wine wasn't just for the rich either. By the 1st century, it was being produced on an enormous scale. Huge ceramic jars called amphorae were filled with wine and stacked onto ships. Some of it was smooth and complex. Some of it was rough and acidic. The wealthy could afford aged blends sweetened with honey. Soldiers and laborers drank whatever was cheap and available. In Pompeii, you could walk into a small tavern, sit on a stone bench, and order a mug of red wine that had traveled across the sea. It might have been spiced or diluted. It might have been terrible, but it was familiar, and it was part of daily life. While this was happening around the Mediterranean, other parts of the world were doing their own thing. In India, ancient texts mentioned fermented drinks made from fruit or sugarcane. In China, rice wines were becoming more refined. In the Andes, people brewed chicha by chewing maize and letting the enzymes in saliva start the fermentation process. In Africa, there were local beers made from sorghum and millet. Alcohol didn't travel from a single point. It appeared wherever people lived close to plants and waited long enough to notice what thyme and yeast could do. What changed in the classical world was scale and structure. People weren't just making alcohol, they were shaping culture around it. They were trading it, taxing it, storing it, and writing laws about it. It was no longer just something people made by accident. It was something they planned for. Fermentation came first. People figured out that if you left the right mix of ingredients alone, it would eventually turn into something drinkable. But distillation was different. It didn't happen by accident. It had to be designed. Distillation is the process of heating a liquid until it turns into vapor, then cooling that vapor until it turns back into liquid. If you do it right, you can separate out alcohol and make something far stronger than anything fermentation alone could produce. The technique probably existed in some form in ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt, but it wasn't used for drinking. It was used for extracting oils, perfumes, and medicines. The people who knew how to do it were often priests, physicians, or alchemists. The real breakthrough came during the Islamic Golden Age, starting around the 8th century. In cities like Baghdad and Cairo, scholars were translating Greek and Persian texts, experimenting with chemistry, and recording their work carefully. They weren't trying to make liquor. In fact, drinking alcohol was forbidden in most Islamic cultures, but they were deeply interested in purification and preservation. One of the things they learned to do was distill wine, not to drink it, but to use it as a solvent or a base for medicine. They called the purified substance alcohol, a word that originally referred to a fine black powder used for eyeliner. Over time, it came to mean the essence of a substance. Eventually, it stuck to alcohol itself. By the 11th and 12th centuries, knowledge of distillation had made its way to Europe. Monks, doctors, and early scientists began experimenting with it. They weren't looking for recreational drinks. They were making medicine, tinctures, elixirs, tonics. Spirits were called aqua vitae, the water of life. They were used to treat everything from the plague to digestive issues. It wasn't long before people started drinking it for other reasons. It was stronger, easier to store, and took up less space than beer or wine. You didn't need barrels. A small flask could do the job. Different regions developed their own traditions. In Ireland and Scotland, they made whiskey. In France, it was brandy. In Eastern Europe, vodka. In Italy, grappa. The drinks reflected the raw materials that were easiest to find: barley, grapes, potatoes, whatever was left over from winemaking or farming. Distilled spirits weren't just another drink. They were different in scale and effect. A few sips could produce a stronger buzz than an entire cup of beer. That made them valuable, and sometimes dangerous. By the late Middle Ages, distillation had changed the way people thought about alcohol. It was no longer just a drink made by farmers. It was a product shaped by science, medicine, and trade. It could be used in a monastery, a pharmacy, or a tavern. It opened the door to something new. Not just stronger drinks, but bigger questions about control, regulation, addiction, and power. Those questions would take centuries to unfold. But for now, distilled alcohol was spreading, quietly, efficiently, one bottle at a time. In the centuries after the fall of Rome, a lot of knowledge scattered or was lost. But alcohol didn't disappear. It just changed hands. In much of medieval Europe, the job of preserving knowledge fell to monasteries. Monks copied texts, studied medicine, and, importantly, brewed alcohol. Brewing beer became part of monastic life. It was practical. It helped sustain the community. And it gave monks something safe to drink in a time when clean water wasn't always reliable. Monasteries brewed for themselves, but they also sold what they made. Some became famous for it. They paid attention to detail. They experimented with ingredients. They took notes. Over time, monastic brewing helped lay the foundation for consistency and quality in European beer. In wine-producing regions, monks managed vineyards and cellars. In places like Burgundy and the Rhine Valley, they kept careful records of soil, weather, and grape harvests. This was the beginning of winemaking as a true craft, not just a household chore. They were not just making wine. They were observing and refining it. Outside the monasteries, alcohol was becoming a part of everyday commerce. In towns and cities, brewers and vintners set up shops. Taverns opened their doors. Alewives, often women, brewed and sold beer from their homes. In larger markets, wine from southern Europe was traded alongside textiles and spices. As trade routes grew, alcohol began to travel farther. Northern Europe imported wine from the Mediterranean. Cities near rivers and ports saw more diversity in what people drank. Beer dominated in colder, grain-producing areas. Wine remained common in warmer climates. Spirits were also beginning to spread. By the late Middle Ages, distilled drinks were no longer just for medicine. People had started drinking them recreationally. They were strong, portable, and easier to store than barrels of beer or wine. Some cities began regulating them. Others taxed them. In this period, alcohol also became more tied to status. Richer people could afford finer wine. They drank from glassware. Their drinks were flavored with imported spices. Poorer people drank simpler beer or local wine, often from rough clay cups or wooden mugs. Still, across classes and regions, alcohol had become something shared. It showed up at weddings and funerals, in harvest festivals and religious holidays. It was part of the rhythm of life. People drank to mark time, to connect with others, to warm themselves in winter, or to celebrate a good crop. Alcohol moved quietly through the medieval world, through monks behind stone walls, through merchants at crowded stalls, through travelers at roadside inns. It was no longer just a discovery. It was an industry, a habit, a part of the everyday. As European powers expanded across the world, alcohol went with them. It became both a tool and a commodity. It was carried on ships, traded at ports, and woven into the systems of empire. The most important drink in this period was rum. Rum started with sugar. In the Caribbean, colonizers set up massive sugar plantations. Slavery was central to this system. Enslaved people were brought from Africa, forced to work in brutal conditions, and used to grow and process the cane. The sugar was boiled down to make molasses. The molasses was shipped to distilleries, where it was turned into rum. That rum was loaded into barrels and sent north to colonies or back across the Atlantic. Sometimes it was even used to buy more slaves. This was the triangle trade: sugar, rum, and human lives, moving between Africa, the Americas, and Europe. Rum was cheap and strong. It was popular with sailors and soldiers. It was also used as currency in some places. You could buy supplies with it. You could pay workers with it. In some parts of colonial America, it was easier to get than money. Meanwhile, other regions were producing their own drinks. In Mexico, indigenous traditions of fermenting agave gave rise to mezcal and later tequila. Spanish colonists brought European distilling techniques and applied them to local plants. The result was something new, a local drink with deep roots and a growing market. In Brazil, they made cachaça from sugarcane. In South Africa, wine estates sprang up in the Cape Colony. In India, British officers and settlers drank brandy, gin, and whiskey, mixing them with tonic or soda water. These habits shaped local production and global preferences. Alcohol was not just being consumed. It was being regulated, taxed, and traded. European powers made laws to control who could produce it and who could sell it. Licenses were granted. Tariffs were collected. In some colonies, local people were restricted or punished for making their own traditional drinks. At the same time, alcohol became a tool of influence. It was offered as a gift in negotiations. It was traded for land or resources. In some cases, it was deliberately introduced to weaken or destabilize communities. The effects were not always immediate, but they were long-lasting. By the 1700s and 1800s, alcohol had become a global product. You could find it in cities, ports, plantations, and forts. It was shipped in bottles, barrels, and flasks. It flowed through taverns and palaces. It moved with armies and settlers. It was carried by missionaries and merchants. It was no longer just a cultural tradition. It was big business. It was infrastructure. And for better or worse, it was shaping the modern world. In the American colonies and the young United States, alcohol was everywhere. People drank beer, wine, cider, rum, and later, whiskey. Drinking was part of daily life. It was seen as normal and often as necessary. For many settlers, especially in rural areas, alcohol was safer than water. It was easier to store, easier to transport, and often more reliable than whatever came from the local stream or well. Apple orchards were planted mainly for cider. Beer was brewed in kitchens and barns. In the cities, taverns became community hubs, places where people met, talked politics, and passed time. Rum had dominated during colonial times, but whiskey started to take over as settlers moved west. On the frontier, there was no sugarcane, but there was grain. Farmers could take leftover corn, rye, or barley and distill it into whiskey. It kept longer than raw grain, and it could be sold or traded more easily. In some places, it even served as a kind of informal currency. Whiskey was strong, portable, and easy to produce in small stills. It became a staple in the backcountry. People drank it at meals, at gatherings, and during work. It was part of weddings and funerals, contracts and celebrations. It was also taxed, which led to problems. In 1791, the federal government placed a tax on distilled spirits. Many small producers saw it as unfair. Protests broke out, and in western Pennsylvania, the resistance turned into what became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. It was one of the first major domestic challenges to federal authority in the United States. The rebellion was eventually put down, but the message was clear. Alcohol was no longer just personal, it was political. At the same time, other parts of the Americas were developing their own spirits. In Mexico, tequila evolved from older forms of agave distillation. The process was refined and commercialized over time, turning it into a recognizable national product. In the Caribbean and Brazil, rum and cachaça remained central. These drinks became tied to identity, pride, and tradition. By the 19th century, alcohol was woven into nearly every part of American and European life. It was consumed at all hours and for all reasons. Doctors prescribed it. Workers relied on it. Politicians drank it openly. In many places, it was expected. But this constant presence also brought new concerns. People began to notice the problems. Alcohol abuse was common. Families suffered. Accidents increased. Some started to argue that the problem was not just the people drinking, it was the drink itself. That concern grew into something much larger. A movement was beginning to take shape, one that would try to change not just how people drank, but whether they drank at all. That was the beginning of temperance, and it would change everything. By the early 1800s, alcohol was deeply rooted in daily life, especially in the United States. But people were starting to push back. Heavy drinking was common. It was not unusual for workers to have whiskey breaks during the day. Public events often involved large amounts of alcohol. Even children sometimes drank watered-down spirits or cider. But not everyone was comfortable with how normal it had become. Religious leaders, doctors, and social reformers began to speak out. They saw alcohol as a cause of poverty, violence, and family breakdown. Some had seen the effects firsthand: children going hungry, wages spent at the tavern, men returning home angry and drunk. Out of that concern came the temperance movement. At first, the message was about moderation: drink less, avoid spirits, choose cider or beer instead of whiskey. But over time, the message shifted. Many began to argue that the only solution was total abstinence, not just moderation, but complete sobriety. Temperance groups formed across the country. One of the most influential was the American Temperance Society, founded in 1826. It spread quickly, especially in small towns and churches. Members pledged not to drink and encouraged others to do the same. Women played a major role in the movement. They were often the ones most affected by alcohol abuse in the home, and they became some of its most powerful voices. Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union worked to raise awareness, lobby for laws, and support those hurt by alcohol. Temperance became more than just a personal choice. It became a political cause. Activists pushed for laws to ban the sale and production of alcohol. Some towns and counties went dry. Others resisted. In the late 1800s, new groups took the cause further. The Anti-Saloon League, for example, focused on national legislation. Its leaders believed that banning alcohol outright was the only way to solve the problem. They were organized, focused, and politically savvy, and over time, they gained support. By the turn of the century, the push for prohibition was no longer on the fringes. It had become a mainstream issue. Churches, newspapers, and politicians were talking about it. Some saw it as a moral duty, others as a way to improve public health or reduce crime. In 1919, the effort finally succeeded. The United States ratified the 18th Amendment, banning the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol. The following year, the Volstead Act was passed to enforce it. Prohibition had begun. For the first time in modern history, a nation had chosen to outlaw alcohol completely. But the story did not end there. In many ways, it was only just beginning. When the 18th Amendment went into effect in 1920, alcohol did not disappear. It just changed shape. Prohibition had been years in the making. Supporters believed it would reduce crime, poverty, and illness. They thought it would strengthen families and clean up society. But the reality was more complicated. Right away, enforcement became a challenge. The law banned making, selling, and transporting alcohol, but not drinking it. People who already had liquor could keep it. Doctors could prescribe medicinal whiskey. Churches could use wine for communion. These exceptions created loopholes, and people found ways to work around them. At the same time, demand didn't go away. Many people still wanted to drink, so they found other ways to get it. Bootleggers made or smuggled alcohol in secret. Some ran homemade stills in basements and barns. Others brought in whiskey from Canada or rum from the Caribbean. Organized crime took control of much of the trade. Gangs formed. They protected their roots and territories with violence. Speakeasies, illegal bars, appeared in cities and towns across the country. Some were small and hidden behind storefronts. Others were elaborate clubs with music, food, and dancing. Police raids were common, but many officers were paid to look the other way. In cities like Chicago and New York, alcohol enforcement became part of a bigger problem. Corruption spread through law enforcement and local government. Gang leaders like Al Capone made fortunes off illegal alcohol. Crime didn't go down. In many places, it got worse. Meanwhile, the alcohol being consumed was not always safe. Without regulation, some bootleg liquor was poorly made or even toxic. People went blind or died from contaminated spirits. Others turned to industrial alcohol that had been repurposed and sometimes deliberately poisoned to discourage consumption. Prohibition also reshaped social habits. For some, drinking became more secretive. For others, it became more glamorous. Jazz clubs, flapper fashion, and nightlife thrived during this era. Alcohol was part of that culture, even if it was technically illegal. Over time, public opinion began to shift. Many people who had supported prohibition started to question it. The costs were high, the results were mixed, and the government was losing potential tax revenue from alcohol sales. In 1933, the law was repealed. The 21st Amendment ended national prohibition. It remains the only time in American history that an amendment has been passed to cancel out another. When legal alcohol returned, it came back with new rules. States were allowed to set their own laws. Some stayed dry for years. Others opened bars and liquor stores almost immediately. Regulation became part of the new landscape: age limits, licensing, taxes, hours of sale. Prohibition had failed to eliminate alcohol, but it left a lasting mark. It reshaped how alcohol was made, sold, and controlled. It changed attitudes, opened new markets, and gave rise to new industries, from legal distilleries to federal enforcement agencies. It also left a warning that something so deeply woven into culture and daily life could not simply be erased by law. The story of alcohol moved forward, but the memory of prohibition never really left. After Prohibition ended, alcohol did not just go back to what it had been before. The world had changed, and so had the way alcohol was made, sold, and understood. One of the biggest changes was scale. Before, brewing and distilling had been local or regional. You drank what was made nearby. But after the repeal of Prohibition, large companies moved quickly to take over production. They had the equipment, the reach, and the money to do it. Small operations struggled to compete. In the United States, breweries and distilleries reopened, but the ones that survived were often the biggest. Brands like Anheuser-Busch, Miller, and Seagram grew quickly. They marketed to a national audience and shaped what people expected from beer and spirits. Alcohol became a business. Factories were built. Bottling lines ran day and night. Distribution networks expanded. Trucks carried beer across state lines. Liquor was stacked on supermarket shelves. Marketing played a huge role. Companies used radio, billboards, newspapers, and eventually television to sell their products. Slogans were tested. Labels were redesigned. Drinking became part of lifestyle advertising. A beer could mean relaxation, friendship, or pride. A cocktail could suggest elegance or escape. This was also the age of branding. A name on a bottle began to mean something, not just what was inside, but what it said about you. Vodka was clear, smooth, and modern. Scotch was old, smoky, and masculine. Bourbon was American and bold. Beer could be light, strong, casual, or serious, depending on how it was sold. During World War II, alcohol production was affected by rationing and resource shortages, but it never disappeared. Soldiers were sometimes issued alcohol. On the home front, drinking remained part of daily life. After the war, alcohol companies saw a surge in demand. In the 1950s and 60s, alcohol became part of the modern image. It was common in offices, at dinner parties, and on airplanes. Cocktail culture took off. Martinis, old fashions, highballs. Drinks had roles and meanings. Bars were places for business, relaxation, or romance. But alongside all of this, there were concerns. More production meant more consumption. More marketing meant broader appeal. Alcohol was everywhere, and problems followed. Drunk driving became a growing issue. So did alcohol dependency. Health officials started to track patterns of abuse, liver disease, and accidents. Families were affected. Communities were affected. Some countries responded with regulation. They taxed alcohol. They limited where and when it could be sold. Some banned ads on television or radio. Others set strict age limits or packaging rules. Warnings were added to labels. But the industry kept growing. By the 1970s and 80s, beer had become a global product. The same brands were found in cities across the world. Liquor followed the same path. What had once been local had become international. Alcohol had changed. It was no longer just a drink. It was a system, industrial, commercial, and deeply embedded in modern life. As alcohol became more global, it also became more personal. People did not just drink. They made choices. What they drank, how they drank, and when they drank said something about who they were. In many places, alcohol became part of national identity. In Mexico, tequila was more than a spirit. It was a symbol of history, of place, of pride. In Scotland, whiskey had deep roots in the landscape and the culture. In Japan, sake was tied to tradition, ceremony, and hospitality. Drinks carried meaning. They showed up at weddings, holidays, and funerals. They were part of celebrations, but also part of mourning. A glass raised in joy looked different than one raised in silence. But the ritual was shared. Even within the same country, different drinks could mark different groups. Wine might be seen as sophisticated, beer might feel casual, a neat pour of bourbon might suggest tradition, a fruity cocktail might suggest playfulness. None of these meanings were fixed, but they traveled with the drink. Alcohol could also signal class. Some drinks were expensive. Others were cheap and accessible. Some were associated with work, a beer after a shift, a flask on a cold morning. Others belonged to leisure, champagne at a party, brandy in a quiet room. Gender played a role too. For a long time, certain drinks were seen as masculine or feminine. Advertising reinforced these ideas. Strong whiskey for men, light wine coolers for women. Those lines have blurred over time, but they still echo in how drinks are sold and perceived. In some cultures, alcohol was a public act. Drinking was social, shared, and visible. In others, it was private, behind closed doors. The rules were not always written, but people learned them. What to bring, how to pour, when to toast. Drinking habits could even mark time and place. A coffee with brandy in the morning in one region, a slow beer over lunch in another, a round of shots late at night in a different setting entirely. For immigrants, alcohol could become a link to home, a familiar bottle on a shelf, a taste that brought back memory. Or it could be something to avoid, if it clashed with faith or tradition. And for those who chose not to drink, that choice also carried meaning. Sometimes it was personal. Sometimes it was religious, medical, or cultural. In many cases, it had to be explained, especially in places where alcohol was assumed to be part of the norm. In all of these ways, alcohol became more than a substance. It became a mirror, reflecting habits, values, and identities. It was not just about what was in the glass, but what surrounded it, who poured it, when it was raised, why it mattered. Alcohol has always changed. But even as styles and flavors evolve, the deeper role it plays as a signal, a symbol, and a part of culture continues. For as long as people have used alcohol, they have also tried to manage it, sometimes through personal discipline, sometimes through social pressure, and sometimes through law. Even after the end of Prohibition, governments kept a close eye on alcohol. In many countries, strict rules controlled how it was made, sold, and consumed. Taxes brought in revenue. Age limits were enforced. Stores and bars had to follow licensing rules. Hours were restricted. Advertising was limited or banned outright in some places. These laws were not just about order. They were also about health and safety. By the mid-20th century, researchers had a clearer understanding of what alcohol could do to the body and mind. They knew it could damage the liver, the brain, the heart. They saw how it affected behavior and decision-making. They connected it to traffic deaths, workplace accidents, and domestic violence. Public health campaigns began to appear. Billboards warned against drinking and driving. Schools taught the risks of underage drinking. Medical groups urged moderation. Some countries added warning labels to bottles. Others launched national efforts to reduce alcohol-related harm. At the same time, addiction was being studied more seriously. For centuries, people who drank heavily were often blamed for being weak or immoral. But by the 1900s, a new view had emerged. Addiction was not just a choice, it was a condition. Alcoholism came to be seen as a disease. It had patterns, symptoms, and stages. Some people were more at risk than others. Treatment programs were developed, support groups formed, The most famous was Alcoholics Anonymous, or AA, which began in the 1930s. Its message spread around the world. Still, stigma remained. Many people struggled in silence. Others did not recognize that they had a problem until things became serious. Families and communities often bore the costs. As alcohol became more available, new challenges emerged. College drinking culture raised concerns. High rates of alcohol use among veterans and workers drew attention. In some areas, access to cheap, strong alcohol led to cycles of poverty and harm that were hard to break. And yet, alcohol remained legal, regulated, taxed, and accepted. The line between use and misuse was not always clear. One person's habit might be another's warning sign. Governments and health organizations walked a careful path. They tried to respect personal freedom while protecting public health. They funded treatment programs, passed safety laws, and tracked data. Some pushed for more restrictions. Others focused on education and outreach. Through it all, the tension stayed. Alcohol was both ordinary and dangerous. It was part of life, but it came with risk. It brought people together, but it also pushed some apart. The conversation around alcohol kept evolving, not in a straight line, but in a slow circle. Use, concern, control, relief, and then again. A pattern that had been repeating for centuries. It was not about stopping alcohol completely. It was about finding balance, and that search was still going on. Today, alcohol exists in more forms, places, and contexts than ever before. It is part of global culture, visible in advertisements, woven into social habits, and surrounded by choice. For many people, it begins as a casual part of adulthood. A drink at a dinner, a toast at a wedding, a glass shared with friends. In much of the world, it is normal, sometimes expected. At the same time, the way people drink and think about drinking has changed. The craft movement brought a wave of new interest in small-scale brewing and distilling. Instead of mass-produced beer, some drinkers looked for local lagers, sour ales, or barrel-aged stouts. Whiskey enthusiasts searched for rare single malts or small-batch bourbons. Bars created menus with custom cocktails and house-made infusions. Behind this was a shift in how alcohol was treated, not just as a substance, but as an experience. Drinking became about flavor, ingredients, presentation. Breweries and distilleries opened their doors for tours. Tastings became events. People talked about hops, oak barrels, botanicals. At the same time, health and wellness trends began to grow. People started asking new questions. How much alcohol is too much? What is the impact on sleep, mood, or long-term health? Researchers studied moderate drinking more closely. Guidelines were revised. Awareness grew. Some chose to cut back. Others stopped entirely. That gave rise to a new space: alcohol-free drinking. Companies developed non-alcoholic beers, spirits, and wines that mimicked traditional drinks without the alcohol. These were not just for people in recovery. They were for anyone who wanted the taste or the ritual without the effect. Sober bars opened in cities. Mocktail menus appeared at weddings and restaurants. Campaigns like Dry January encouraged people to take breaks, and many did. Drinking had become flexible. It could mean a complex cocktail or a club soda, a celebration or a quiet night in. It was no longer just about fitting in. It was about choice. Technology also changed the drinking experience. Apps tracked alcohol intake. Online communities shared reviews, recipes, and support. Alcohol delivery services made it easier to access. while digital spaces allowed people to explore and reflect. Even within the industry, the tone shifted. Some brands marketed themselves as low alcohol or mindful. Others embraced their boldness. The variety grew, so did the dialogue. Not everyone drinks now, and not everyone who drinks often. The culture has grown more open, but also more aware. In many ways, alcohol has returned to its earlier role, as something people use intentionally, as something shaped by context, time, place, company, and purpose. It has not disappeared, but it has changed again, quietly, and with it, the way people live alongside it. From ancient fruit left to rot in a bowl, to global industries and cultural traditions, alcohol has followed people everywhere they've gone. It has shown up in temples, in taverns, on cargo ships, and in quiet kitchens. It has been offered in celebration, consumed in sorrow, and used to pass the time. Through all of history, it has been shaped by what people needed and what they believed. It was medicine before it was habit. It was sacred before it was casual. Sometimes it brought people together. Sometimes it pushed them apart. What makes alcohol different from many other substances is how ordinary it became. It is not just a chemical. It is part of the way people organize time, space, and memory. A glass at a table, a toast with friends, a bottle passed from one hand to another. And yet, it has always walked a fine line between joy and harm, between connection and loss, between celebration and control. Across cultures, that line is drawn differently. Some societies embrace alcohol. Others avoid it. Some build it into their holidays. Others teach children to steer clear. Some manage it through laws. Others leave it to habit. But the pattern repeats. Discovery, use, concern, reform, and then it starts again. In modern life, alcohol is familiar. It's something you see in commercials, in movies, in family gatherings. It is sold in supermarkets and corner stores. It is offered without thought and refused with explanation. And yet, underneath that familiarity, it still carries weight. It holds memory. It can bring comfort or confusion, warmth or distance. It can change a moment, a mood, or a direction. Maybe that's why it has lasted. Not because it is simple, but because it is not. It reflects who people are: social, curious, flawed, and looking for meaning. It adapts to the times. It follows the rhythms of culture. It responds to law, belief, and experience. Thousands of years after someone first tasted something sweet and strange, the story is still going. Not because alcohol itself demands attention, but because people continue to shape how it fits into their lives. That story does not have a clear end. Only moments, passed between generations, quietly, repeated, shared, just as it always has been.